Hi, I'm Danny with Tax 29 Tax Service.
And I'm Andy. You know, Danny, the prices of everything keeps going up and up.
Inflation.
Well, at Tax 29, we said enough. We're keeping our pricing structure the same this year as what we had last tax season.
So whether you file in one of our local offices or whether you file with us online at tax29.com, you'll get the same professional tax prep at affordable pricing along with year-round service.
For a list of our pricing or to find out more, stop by one of our local offices or visit us at tax29.com.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the Earth and our universe is really his story.
Hi, welcome once again to Discovering His Story, a production of Youngstown Christian Television. In this program, we try to look at the biblical accounts and the accounts of secular history and see where they intertwine, where they meet one another, and learn both about the Bible and about ancient history. We are in the period of time which we are calling ancient times, and specifically looking at Greece. We have spent a couple of weeks looking at the history of Greece, the beginning of the Greek culture, and specifically last time looking at different aspects of that culture, the excellence that was the predominant theme in many different areas of Greek life, and much of which have come down to us to this day. As we are looking at the last few items of representations of this Greek culture, we want to move today into sculpture. Sculpture is an area in which, of course, the Greeks excelled. The Romans attempted to copy them, and of course, even today, people in sculpting real figures use the Greeks as an example. This page from a book shows the different styles of sculpture, and we'll look more in detail at them. There are three basic styles, or three main periods, we could say, because the styles of sculpture developed in these periods of time. First of all, there was the archaic period in which sculptures were rather stiff and expressionless. More realistic maybe than what had been around prior to this, but there's not really movement indicated or any kind of emotion. The next period of sculpture is the classical period, in which they sought to, let's go back there. I forgot, I had another picture. This is on a vase from the archaic period. And although they seem to be moving, in fact, it looks like they're, let's see, one guy's saying to the other one, if we hold it right here, we can get channel 11. No, but they are, I guess, rather stiff compared to some of the later ones. Okay, from there we move to the classical period, in which they sought to represent the ideal man. So a lot of nudity here because they're trying to portray the human body in the best way that they can. And so you have items from the Olympics, for example, and oratory, people doing different things, and portrayed in such a way as to indicate that there's movement. And then the last period of sculpture is called the Hellenistic period. And in this period, there's a calm self-confidence of the previous period being replaced by a frenzied emotional tone in which it loses its simple beauty, according to the scholars. This one on the left is called the Dying Gaul. The sculpture on the right is Leo Cohen and his sons. I'd be hard-pressed to tell the difference between some of the different periods, but those that are artists can do so. All right, so those are the three areas of sculpture. Now let's move to architecture. In architecture, we find the different styles reflected primarily in the temples. The most spectacular example of architecture in the Greek world, of course, is the Parthenon in Athens. Started in 447 BC, it featured numerous architectural innovations and sat on a base 70 meters long and 26 meters wide. It was constructed in the Doric style, which we'll get to that in a few minutes, the different styles of columns, or orders, I should say. It had 17 columns along its length and 8 columns along its width, each of which was over 10 meters high and 2 meters in diameter. Right-angled buildings tend to create an optical illusion that can make them look top-heavy. To compensate for this effect, the Parthenon's columns utilize an architectural effect called entasis, and they get gradually thinner from the middle up. From a distance, it looks like they're straight, but in reality, they're not. The magnificent figures carved into the space between the top of the columns and the rooftop are some of the finest ever examples of ancient sculpture. Lord Elgin, a British diplomat, removed many of these from the ruins in 1801. Shipped back to Britain, they are now housed in, you guessed it, the British Museum, whose ownership of them has been disputed ever since. Other striking parts of the temples that have survived include the Parthenon frieze. Only 2.5 inches thick at its maximum depth, it depicts a procession of 360 noble Athenians, as well as numerous animals and gods. A pinnacle of art, barely visible in its original position, the Parthenon frieze stood 1 meter tall and would have encircled almost the whole building's upper walls, making its total length 160 meters. So fantastic sculpture work as a part of the architecture. And as you remember, the Apostle Paul addressed Greek idolatry after passing by this edifice, as well as the altar to the gods in Acts 17. As a part of the Greek architecture, we should look at what are called orders. These architectural orders give us the designs that are used in what we call columns. Technically, they're not columns, they're orders. On the left, you see the Doric order, which is a little plainer. It's the first ones that were developed. They're solid, they're strong, masculine-looking features, not much ornamentation. Then we move to the middle order. It's called the Ionic. These are splendorous, graceful elements with a scroll-shaped capital. The capital is the very top of the order, and you can see the scroll shape that's twirling around, and that is the Ionic. The order on the right is called Corinthian. The Corinthian orders are richly carved and ornately designed in their capitals. The capitals of these have a lot of design to them. So when you're looking at different orders, whether it's somewhere in Europe or whether it's in the United States, you now will be able to tell, is this a plain and simple Doric, or is this Ionic with some scroll-shaped, or is it the very ornately designed capitals of the Corinthian? That brings us to the end of our look at Greek culture. Next, we're going to look at how that culture spread how it became dominant throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. And to do that, we're going to need to stop for a moment, take a brief break, and then we'll come back and look at the empire of Alexander the Great. Come right back on Discovering His Story. Well, welcome back to Discovering His Story. We're looking at the ancient civilization of Greece, and the question arises, having looked at the great cultural advances of Greece, just how did that come to dominate not only the area around Greece, but the area around the whole Mediterranean, and eventually Europe, and influences even us here in America. It largely can be attributed to a man by the name of Alexander the Great. First, before we get to Alexander, we need to talk a little bit about his father and the rise of Macedonia. Now, most of us pronounce it Macedonia, but I found that when I was in Greece that they pronounce the C's with a hard C, so it's Macedonia. In fact, I've discovered that not only in Greek but in Latin as well, the C's that we commonly pronounce as soft C's are really hard C's, and the J's are really I's. So that can be confusing, and if I go back and forth between the pronunciations, please don't judge me. I'm trying to be accurate as I can, but old habits die hard. So we're looking at the rise of Macedonia, pictured here in the map on the left of our screen. You can see that technically Greece is south of Macedonia. We call this the Greek Empire and the spread of Hellenism, but in reality, Macedonia was a separate region from Greece, but it was taken over by Greece physically, but Greece then intellectually, culturally took over Macedonia. All right, we'll see a little bit about how that happened. So in 338, there was a man from Macedonia by the name of Philip who conquered and controlled all of Greece. On the upper right-hand side of our slide here is an accurate enlarged reproduction of an ancient gold medallion depicting the king of Macedonia, Philip II. Philip of Macedon was father of the man we call Alexander the Great, and architect of the powerful Macedonian phalanx, which later conquered the Persian Empire. Philip made the military a way of life for the Macedonian men. It became a professional occupation that paid well enough that the soldiers could afford to do it year-round, unlike in the past when the soldiering had only been a part-time job, something the men would do during the off-peak times of farming. This allowed him to count on his men regularly, building unity and cohesion among his men. It is he that elevated the Macedonians into a leading nation in Europe after having defeated all neighboring lands and annexing them to Macedonia. He defeated the Illyrians, the Thracians, the Greeks, the Scythians, and the Triballians. The Macedonian victory over the Greeks at Chaeronea in 338 BC, at which young Alexander also took part, ensured Macedonian dominance. Thus, the Greek historian Theopompus of Chios wrote that Europe had never seen a man like King Philip of Macedonia, and called his history of the mid-4th century BC the Philippic history. Unfortunately, Philip was assassinated 2 years later in 336 BC. His tomb has been discovered is under a large hill. For centuries, I suppose, people just saw this huge hill and wondered what it was. Finally, somebody dug into it and found that it was the tomb of Philip II. And inside, you can find all kinds of artifacts from Philip including a lot of gold pieces and pictures of things like this. His son, Alexander, was raised culturally Greek. So the Greek culture had become dominant for the Macedonians after they conquered Greece. So Alexander was raised culturally Greek. His tutor was the Greek philosopher Aristotle. So well-educated and committed to what we might call Greek culture. Interesting story about Alexander in his youth. When he was 12 years old, he observed a black stallion that a man wished to sell, but neither Philip nor his friends could ride him. When no one wants to buy a horse you can't ride. So Philip was about to send the man and his horse away when Alexander approached the group, criticizing them for letting such a fine steed get away. They laughed at him and asked if he thought that he could ride the horse, and Alexander replied in the affirmative. Challenged to make good on his boast, he agreed to ride the horse if they would promise that he could keep it. They agreed, thinking they had nothing to lose. But Alexander had noticed something. The horse was afraid of his shadow. Alexander simply turned him toward the sun so that he would not see his shadow, spoke soothing words to him, mounted him, and rode. Naming him Bucephalus, which means ox head, because of the scar on the horse's thigh, this stallion became an excellent war horse that performed well for Alexander throughout his career. In fact, saved his life on numerous occasions. Well, let's consider what happened to Alexander following his father's death. But before we do, I found an interesting place online that takes old sculptures or ancient sculptures and converts them into how a person would look today. And here's what they did with Alexander the Great. A good-looking young man in any age, would you not agree? Well, Alexander consolidated Philip's forces at 20 years old. Now, the Old Testament had some predictions that relate to Alexander. In fact, in a dream in Daniel 8, Daniel is shown that Persia, at the time of Alexander, it was ruled over by Darius III. And the Persia in that dream is a two-horned ram, the two horns standing for Media and Persia. This victorious ram came from the east, pushing its way westward, northward, and southward, representing the Persian conquests, which included Syria, Armenia, and Egypt. The longer horn represents Persia. The shorter of the duo is Media. Marcellinus, a 4th century historian, stated that, interestingly, the Persian ruler bore the head of a ram as he stood in front of his army. Well, Daniel then sees a one-horned goat from the west, which stands for Alexander the Great, or Greece, which rushes toward the ram, smashes it to the ground, and stomps it to pieces. Historical drawings depict a one-horned goat as the symbol for the ancient Greek armies. Daniel sees this powerful horn suddenly broken and its might divided fourfold. All right, so the timeline looks like this. We have Philip of Macedon appearing on the scene in conquering Greece about the same time as Artaxerxes III is in Persia. At the same time, we have the death of Hippocrates. By 338, Philip controls all of Greece, and by that time, Artaxerxes III had accomplished this, killed all his brothers and sisters. Now, then he reconquered Egypt, but he was poisoned by his son. And so in 338, ruling till 336, Arsus takes over. He was poisoned and his whole family was murdered. Well, in 336, murder comes to the Philip family as well, as Philip is assassinated. And about that time, as Darius III comes on the throne in Persia, he is in fact the grandson of the brother of Artaxerxes II. So he has a connection back to the biblical times that we had been looking at some weeks ago. And from 336 to 323 then, Alexander takes over. He is immediately prepared to carry out his father's desire to invade Persia, but which he did not live long enough to do. And by 333, Alexander defeats Darius III, and the Persian Empire is destroyed. That's going to be the subject of our narrative here as we proceed from this point. There's one other prophecy that I wanted to mention concerning Alexander the Great, and that comes in Daniel 3. Daniel 11, verse 3, which says, "Then a warrior king will arise, he will rule a vast realm and do whatever he wants." That's talking about Alexander the Great. Well, if Alexander is going to fight against Persia, he has to get from Europe into Asia, across the Hellespont. We looked at that back when Xerxes was coming the other direction. And so Alexander in 334, along with his army, crossed the Hellespont, which separated Asia Minor from the Middle East, and joining with the army that Philip had already sent to secure a landing place in Asia. Before landing from his ship, Alexander jumped into the water and threw his spear ashore, an indication of his intention. I should mention here at this point that, and I'm not sure whether it was at this point or exactly when, but Alexander did something which would help him a great deal, as well as to provide for the future generations, and that is, he standardized the Greek language. Now, we not only have Macedonians fighting in his army, but people from different areas of Greece. And you know that Greece was made up of many city-states, each speaking their own dialect of Greek. Alexander determined that in order to be successful in battle, they needed to all speak the same language and not be thinking about, what did he mean by it? What did the commander mean by that? And so he enforced a standardization of Greek, which later became the Common Greek, which we know as Koine Greek. That language was not only the language of Alexander's army, but as we're going to see, as he conquers more and more territory, it becomes the language of the governments over which he rules, and eventually of the people living throughout that empire. So the Greek language that we find in the New Testament, as we find that the whole New Testament is written in Greek, with the possible exception of Matthew, possibly was written in Hebrew first, but primarily written in Greek and was communicated to a world which spoke Greek. This goes back to Alexander standardizing the language and then spreading the language through his conquests. Interesting. So Alexander proceeds to do battle with Darius III, the Persian army, at a place called Granicus in 334. That's where the Persian army gathered to attack him. And you can see it's just across the border, across the Hellespont. This was a hard-fought battle with Alexander leading his cavalry downstream, as you can see there by the arrows on the left. He went downstream and came across the river Granicus at night to meet the forces of Darius III, who did not lead his army at this point. He wasn't there because he didn't think this was any big deal. He sent one of his generals instead, a Greek mercenary named Memnon of Rhodes. Now, most of the Macedonian cavalry crossed before the Persians sounded the alarm. Alexander was wounded during the battle, but he overcame his injuries, and the superior strength and weaponry of the Macedonians ensured their victory. The armies of Darius included a large contingency of Greek mercenaries. Do you see them there on the battle chart? They're in the back. Alexander was offended by these Greeks fighting against him, and so any survivors of the Greek mercenaries were either killed or sent as slaves to mines. A very interesting story takes place somewhere along the way here, and I've included it at this point, and that's the story of Alexander the Great and the Gordian knot. You may have heard of the Gordian knot. It sometimes is used in literature and expressions today as something which can't be unraveled. Well, the Gordian knot is one of the most famous legends associated with the conquests of Alexander. The episode took place in 333 BC in the ancient city of Gordium, located in Phrygia, which is modern-day Turkey. The Gordian knot was a massive convoluted mass that was tied into various knots that no one knew how to untie. In fact, you couldn't even find an end to try to untie it. And that was tied to a yoke on an ancient wagon. The origins of the knot were attributed to Gordius, the father of the famous King Midas. An ancient oracle had prophesied that whoever could untie the Gordian knot would become the ruler of all Asia. This prophecy added to the knot's mystique and significance. After securing victories in Asia Minor, Alexander arrived in Gordium in the spring of 333 BC. Determined to fulfill the prophecy and consolidate his claim to the title of ruler of Asia, Alexander decided to tackle the Gordian knot. He examined the knot closely, recognizing its complexity and the difficulty of untying it through conventional means. The knot was so intricately entwined that its ends were hidden, making it nearly impossible to untangle. Instead of attempting to untie the knot by traditional methods, Alexander drew his sword and cut through the knot with a single bold stroke. It reminds me of that scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark. Remember when Harrison Ford, Indiana Jones, is being pursued and he comes up to a marketplace and there's a guy standing there in a robe with a big sword, and he twirls it around and he's going to cut up Indiana Jones, and Jones simply takes out a pistol, aims it, and fires at him. Not what he expected. Well, nobody expected Alexander the Great simply to take out a sword and cut the knot. That's not how it was supposed to be done. But that's what he did. And this decisive action effectively untied the knot. Alexander's solution was seen as a demonstration of not of cheating, but of his ingenuity, his decisiveness, and willingness to think outside the box. It symbolized his capability to overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges through bold and direct action. By cutting the knot, Alexander was perceived to fulfill the prophecy, reinforcing his destiny as the ruler of Asia. So he doesn't know it yet, but the Old Testament prophecies have foretold that he's going to conquer that whole area. And now cutting the Gordian knot in advance of him conquering is an indication that Alexander is destined for greatness. And of course, he would be called Alexander the Great for good reason. Now, next time we'll look at how he proceeded from this point, what happens when he encounters the Persians once again, and an interesting story about when Alexander makes his way to Jerusalem. And we'll find out these and many other interesting things about Alexander the Great next time on Discovering His Story.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.